Next up, we have Nick Lynch, who is going to talk about this more from an academia and industry perspective.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you very much for the chance to present. Yeah, as Nicola said, I'm going to give you a bit of a blended talk because I both worked for pharma and biotech, particularly. So just in the context of scope, our company has been working a lot for the last 10 years with biotechs, pharma, and a number of research institutes, both in the UK and elsewhere. And we've been involved in quite a few different projects, both from a data perspective, FAIR Plus, which was an IMI project that some of you may have heard about, Open Facts, which is a triple store. And as you can see, both trying to represent some of our customers, and we've been involved in ELNs all the way back from about 2006 at AstraZeneca, where we introduced the chemistry ELN. Then we went to a biology ELN, which was different. And then we've also been involved in ELNs more in farm side. But as I say, very much life science, drug discovery, agro and chemistry. But I've tried to make, I'm not mentioning any particular ELNs today, but hopefully some of the things we'll talk about and welcome questions are representative of typical ELN scenarios. So I'll make obviously the talk available. So rather than, I'm not going to go through every bullet, but trying to pick out some of the things that we felt were particularly important to going through an ELN. And with the previous talks, I'm not trying, hopefully won't repeat too much. So my first point really is having a stable sort of background to introducing your ELN. And so I would suggest that wherever you are in your journey, if it's your first ELN, it's going to be the biggest jump in terms of the processes, the change management, as we heard earlier. How do you go about this change? That first ELN, we found from all our experiences, this is that biggest jump, because both you've got that change from paper to something that's electronic, and equally, I would say that you cannot do everything in that first ELN. So you really have to keep that scope manageable, both from the project perspective and your own sanity, but also the way that you engage with the potential suppliers, that you have to be realistic about what you can do, but more importantly, what you can be realistic with your stakeholders as well, because ultimately they're your customers, and you have to be able to sort of manage the scope of this project. Otherwise, it's going to get out of hand, partly because of all the other tentacles and connections that you need to make an ELN successful. So, as I say, the user engagement we feel is a key part of this. So classic sort of paper, post-its on brown paper is a really effective way of engaging with your community, both at the beginning, and I'm sort of more talking about this beginning phase, because if you don't get the beginning phase right, then anything in terms of implementation is not going to be successful. So really bringing people together is we feel important, and the quicker that you can do that, assuming that you actually want an ELN, because hopefully that's part of the process, and really validating that it's going to be useful. But this user engagement and creating hopefully a user community very early is really critical. Some points about how you go about or where you are in this sort of as I mentioned. So that as-is understanding is critical. And a classic example we would say is, do you actually have some consistency in terms of SOPs, standard operating procedures, for how an experiment, and perhaps I'm using the word experiment generically here, because I think this could apply to anything, not just life science. But if you haven't got some of that consistency in terms of SOPs, then you really need to sort that out first, because if you haven't got some of that beginning to sort of hold people together, then your project is risking a huge amount right at the beginning. So yeah, consistent SOPs are critical. Going back to the point about, that the ELN is probably not the only part of the journey that you're going to be on. We've heard a lot about data, and I'm going to mention some more about data in a minute. But again, this whole combination of interconnected wheels and cogs that really make a successful ELN, ERN implementation, that we talked about a bit about process. We've talked about earlier before about people and change. And so the tool part, the actual product, or the ELN, ERN that you select, or even more, because that is only at least only a quarter of what you're going to be doing in this journey. And to pick up on the point I think earlier about, is there one ELN to rule them all? Certainly not even in in the biotech industry that we work in, it's quite rare that a company only has one ELN, particularly with the diversity of modality types and differences between chemistry and biology and late stage science as well. That in the beginning, perhaps 20 years ago, 10 years ago, people thought they could have one ELN, but it's very much the case that people are sort of, differentiating by capability to really sort of deliver value to the users. So a key question is where you're going to put your data. And I would say that the ELN implementation has to go in hand with the data strategy. So if you're implementing an ELN without good places to put data, then you're, again, really risking the project. And I certainly would recommend that you don't put your data in the ELN. And the reason for that is that the ELN is normally not a very good place to put complex data, particularly if you've got high throughput data or data that you really want to actually use later. You can put some of the data in the ELN, but I would say that it shouldn't be the only place you put the data. You need a proper storage place, and you need some of these processes, which we will perhaps cover later in the discussions, to really make that data effective. Some of the bad cases that we saw where in the beginning ELNs or the experiment capture was thought everything goes to the ELN. It is really risking that data. And obviously these days, I see certainly in our industry that the data is the real asset. And so yes, the ELN is great for the runtime process, but you have to really think. So if you haven't got that parallel activity about data, then really that's a huge issue that you will come back to bite you later on. So I think there was already, Sammy mentioned some cases about the things that you might forget or might overlook, and obviously the change management of an ELN, and perhaps depending on what other things you're doing at the time. We've seen sort of, if you look at the examples of the CRIC and other groups where new buildings or whole buildings have been built, that's a great chance to put in that infrastructure. But if you're working in a smaller lab and a smaller scale, you still need to think about the extra infrastructure that you might need and the ability to make the ELN a useful deployment for users, depending on whether it be a very hands-on experiment, whether it be a high throughput experiment, all of those things. And so you can't just think about the spend or the activity to deploy an ELN. It's all about the holistic view to deliver value to your customers. Other things that I would suggest that are important to think about early on is sustainability. If you haven't got the right resources, and if you haven't got that long-term plan in terms of top-down support as well as bottom-up support in terms of data stewards, as we heard earlier, then again, your sort of the ability to deliver value and certainly think about success metrics, not just at the beginning, but also how will you monitor the ELN rollout. Back to this point about SOPs, you really need to sort of do regular checks, and this is particularly we see in life science because of the issue of patentability and aspects like that. Then you really need to be able to think about how you're monitoring the uptake and the quality of those experiment write-ups, particularly if hopefully the groups are engaged and you can keep that focused. So just a couple of points to finish off. I say I'll make this available. The important point about supplier engagement, again, really thinking about your requirements, as the previous talk from James about sort of trying to assess the different supplier, the different options that you have. And certainly open source isn't completely free. You really need to think about that balance between commercial and paid for. We've been involved in a sort of a number of different options there, both commercial because they tend to be the ones used in biotech pharma, but also the open source. But you really need to factor in the resources to support that, and whether that's a freemium model with the support of the supplier. So all of these things have to really suggest that you think of them up front before you even start the project. So a couple of points to finish. So yes, so really some take-home messages from this is that without those consistent processes, you're running a risk. And it is a little bit like, you buy something fancy or you invest in something fancy, but without the ability to sustain, maintain, and make usable, then you're pretty nuts, frankly. And I'll put these links to some good recommendations on SOPs and other points that we've collected over the last year on a couple of projects. So in the talk, I'll make that available. And yeah, happy to take any questions.